Hello, I am here working on a character reference sheet. This is something that's useful to do really anytime you have a project that you want to stay on model for, or if you want other people to be able to draw your character. I'm working on one partly for the practice and partly because I want to have things to submit for Art Fight, which is not until July, but I intended to get this done in March, and it is now April, so it takes a while to actually complete an intended project, and I may as well start now. So this is this little griffin character. I'm doing the line art digitally today because it is a reference sheet, and that means I want to make it very precise. Usually I prefer inking by hand and then scanning it in because it's livelier, I think, more organic looking, and I just enjoy inking by hand more, and I can do it faster because I can't undo and redo lines until they're perfect. And of course, undoing and redoing lines until they're perfect is handy for a reference sheet. It's supposed to be very accurate rather than pretty. When I'm making reference sheets, I try to think of what will help me when I'm doing commissions or Art Fight work of other people's designs, and I try to make sure that information is on my sheet as well. Here's another reason for doing it digitally. I feel like her neck is too long, so I can just move her head and keep inking from there. This character essentially has the anatomy and build of a cat, but I do bring out the curve of her chest a little bit more than I would if she was just a cat, to give kind of an indication that she might have a keel bone here for her wings to attach to. Birds always have a very rounded chest created by the keel bone, which is a very large version of the human sternum. In a bird, that bone is very, very big, because it anchors the flight muscles, which are also very, very big. And I am learning about bird anatomy because I made the insanely brilliant decision to make a project that was full of birds and bird-like creatures without knowing how to draw birds. There is a school of thinking in learning to draw art, in learning art, that sometimes you learn best by doing instead of just picking out things to practice. It would not have really occurred to me to learn to draw birds, but suddenly I put myself in a situation where I had to learn it because I was doing a project that had a ton of birds in it. And over on my other monitor, I'm also looking at references of cats to make sure that I have these legs and hindquarters looking relatively solid. I might actually take out 15 or 20 minutes sometime this week and draw cat legs and the skeletal structure of the back half of a cat so that I'm familiar with that and can make good posing choices accordingly. Having looked at my references in another monitor, I have discovered that her feet are too straight up and down to look natural. There is always someone who knows these things, and that person might find your work, and that person will have a better experience if that person can tell that you've at least tried to be accurate. I know that I find it very, very frustrating when I'm watching a Disney film or something like that. Don't watch Disney films so much anymore because they haven't made anything I'm interested in years. But I remember one of the many, many things I didn't like about Frozen. But that's not what this video is about. I'm just mentioning that it was frustrating to me to see the reindeer acting like a dog, because reindeer aren't dogs, and it was kind of funny and tangled when the horse was a dog, but horses are also not dogs. These are animals that have their own body language and their own behaviors and their own personalities, and there are people who work with them and people who know what they're supposed to be like, and people who love those animals and don't really want every animal in the world to be a dog. And I try to do some research when I'm including an animal or even something that's evoking a particular animal. And I want to make sure that I'm depicting something based on what that animal is and not my idea of what that animal might be. And I also don't want to just turn it into some other animal I'm more familiar with. So it's a long way of saying that even though this is a fantasy creature and it's not really a cat, I am trying to give her anatomy that is fairly accurate. And if I had decided I wanted a griffin that was based on a dog, because you can do whatever you want, then I would be looking at pictures of dogs in another tab. But I decided to go with the more traditional cat. Now, she is a house cat. She's kind of loosely based on a house cat mixed with a sparrow. So later on I will also be looking at sparrows in another tab, instead of the more traditional eagle, lion. And there are story reasons for that. She's supposed to be, for one thing, a juvenile creature. She is kind of youthful and non-threatening. And she's also the words hero and protagonist are sometimes used interchangeably. I don't think they should be. They have different story meanings. She is a good aligned character, and she is among the protagonists. This is a story with a largish cast, but she's supposed to be, you know, a character that you look at and you don't expect menace from her, and you don't expect sabotage. You're not waiting for her to ruin your day. Typically, you want a character to have some visual indication of a role in the story. And of course, you can have twist characters and surprising characters and all of that. But even then, there's an initial response that you specifically want and are trying to get. And if I made this character too intimidating, then I would have people wasting their mental effort when they shouldn't, because people do invest mental effort into a story. They want to kind of figure out where you're going and what to pay attention to. Attention is cognitive work, and it is a distraction and kind of an unwise, dishonest use of your viewer's time if you're indicating there's a mystery where there isn't one. And of course, you can never completely tell where people will focus in a story or what they will take from it, but there are some guidelines you can follow to avoid, misappropriating your story intentions or miscommunicating. And, obviously, as an English speaker writing in the English language, I'm also kind of expecting that most of my audience will be familiar with Western storytelling conventions. The visual language might be different in another region, another area, but I can only use the languages that I know, right? And in the visual tradition that I've learned, that I know, in my language, soft rounded shapes and big heads and big eyes usually suggest a certain amount of innocence. And of course that can be played with. There are characters with these features that are sinister for other reasons. You can even create interesting effects by juxtaposing features that indicate innocence with features that communicate corruption or something like that. And maybe you can even think of some examples. But this character is supposed to be pretty straightforward. And I don't want anyone to be wasting their time or the mental energy that I have asked them to put into my story, wondering if she's evil. So, that was a long way of saying that she is a pussycat, basically, literally and figuratively. And you should be able to look at her and understand something of what she is. Another thing that I'm communicating with this design, or hopefully suggesting, is that the magical creatures in this universe are intelligent and they can speak. Because when I'm looking at a fantasy work, one of the first things that I wonder is, do the dragons talk? I like it when the interesting creatures can speak, because then I know the story can play with some interesting perspectives from creatures that don't really exist, and the speculative fiction will speculate in a direction that I find personally interesting and rewarding, so I want to know, do the dragons talk? So, when I design a creature like this, I try to make her very expressive and with kind of a more humanized face. She has human-looking eyes. She doesn't have either cat eyes or bird eyes. They're very anthropomorphic eyes. I want people to look at the promotional art for something like this and think, oh, that looks like the creatures are probably intelligent, and that will tell the person either they're like me and they vibe with what I want and what I create, and they want to see the creatures talk, or maybe that person doesn't like friendly dragons and friendly griffins and is thinking, I will give this a pass. That looks like, I don't know, this isn't what I want from a story, so I don't know off the top of my head why you don't want the dragons to talk, but I can understand that that's a preference. Must be a fairly common preference, because I find so many stories where the dragons don't talk. Now, on this part of the sheet, I'm just showing a close-up on this beak muzzle type thing. I feel as if this character is not terribly complicated. It's specifically, I designed these things so that they'll be easy to draw multiple times because I intend to do sequential art, and I don't want something that's going to overcomplicate my job, and I also don't want something that's going to communicate poorly on a page. You might see this character on a page at like this size, and I want something of her attitude to be visible. So I haven't done a full turnaround. I just have a standing pose and a sitting pose, and people who are familiar with the anatomy of a cat will look at these and go, oh, I know what that is, that's a cat, and I probably don't need to do a full turnaround. But I did do a profile view of the face, and I did a close-up on this beak, and I'm also going to do a close-up on her hand and her foot, and some special focus on the wings. Now this is for Art Fight. This is going to be posted to people who are doing art for free for other people out of the goodness of their hearts. And I'm just fixing this arm because I realize it's way thinner than the arm on the other pose. So I don't expect anyone to be drawing unfolded wings unless the person happens to be a bird artist who wants to tackle that for some reason. That's the beauty of the wings can be folded, and then you just can get away with just a simple shape. When I do Art Fight, I'm mostly focused on doing art for other people. During the year, I don't take free requests because it could be too much of a time investment. I only take commissioned work. But during Art Fight, it's fun and it's a game, and it is good practice to draw a lot of different designs. So I do participate in Art Fight, and I am focused on drawing for other people. I don't expect people to draw for me, but sometimes I know people like to return attacks. I keep talking about Art Fight as if everyone knows what it is. It's an art trading game where people just post their characters and you can decide to draw art of them, and they can return it if they choose. And I always post a design so people can return art if they like to, because it feels kind of unfriendly to post nothing. And I do want to be courteous and make sure that, you know, it's not unduly difficult for them to return art by making a clear reference sheet and one that's not of something that's really difficult or unpleasant to draw. I tend to do art for people who have animal characters because I enjoy those. So I thought that probably be some interest in this thing that's essentially a cat. You can phone in the wings, it's just a cat. Cat with a weird face. And I am working on my wing anatomy myself. I know that this is not perfect. I've been using some very helpful resources from DeviantArt that I will link to in the description of both this video and the post for this page. So I am now belatedly looking at my reference image in another monitor and fixing some things about this wing that do not look right. I do not know the technical terms for this anatomy here. I'm looking at a picture of a sparrow and I'm just kind of simplifying it. My resources have told me that a real bird will have 10 primary flight feathers. I have simplified it down to 8, and it's fairly common practice in a design of this type of style to remove anatomy. Everyone's seen four-fingered cartoon hands, right? It just makes things simpler, and most people's eyes won't catch it. Only someone who's familiar with birds and an artist of birds is going to be likely to notice that she has only 8 primaries. So it's something I can get away with without standing out to most viewers, and the people who do know are probably going to be able to accept it because it's fairly obvious what's happening. I also don't render whiskers or too much fur feathers. And that looks really bad. I'm going to redraw that. I possibly don't even really need a close-up on the foot because it is just a cat's paw. But it doesn't take long to draw, so I just included a cat's paw. Suppose cats can have differently colored pads, so it might be worthwhile showing that A, she does have rendered foot pads, B, they are pink. I keep referring to these as hands and feet instead of as paws. They are paws. This is not quite a hand, which is why I redid the thumb when it looked too much like a human thumb, and I'm not adding any palm lines to it. But I'm calling them hands and feet because because it is a griffin that has a different type of limb in the front and in the back. So I keep naturally referring to it as hands and feet. And I think, again, I made her neck a little bit too long. But I should finish the head before I move it. I do give her teeth. I think it's a nice way to add a little bit more of an integrated look to the face. I like to kind of take this sort of creature that has generally a distinct front and back. Like a griffin often looks like 2 different creatures stitched together, right? I find it kind of a fun visual thing to make it look more like a seamless creature, but still identifiably a griffin. So her thing is that her body is fairly seamless. She has different front and back legs, but they both kind of follow the anatomy of a cat. And then her face is this combination of different things that are mostly bird, but there are also teeth. And her eyes are just kind of stylized and not either thing. And it's supposed to be kind of up to your imagination how much of this covering is fur and how much of it is down or feathers. A lot of animation these days is CGI, and they either texture everything or they don't texture it and it looks eerily smooth and plastic. So I think that loses something, because in stylized 2D art, you can kind of let people imagine what the texture of something is, and in a lot of other ways you can leave details to be rendered by the mind of the viewer. And there's a lot of good things that can happen when you do that, and it's often, I find, not particularly helpful to the art to have to render everything. I don't think that's helpful. I think that we've lost a lot of good things about design that way, and I hope that those things come back someday. Like to see CGI domination of the animation industry end, but that's maybe not going to happen in my lifetime. So we have to just create the kind of art we want to see, right? And the more I practice at it, the better I'll get. This is based on the wings of a sparrow, so they have a distinct kind of wedge shape, which is not completely correct here, but I'm still working. And of course she's not actually a sparrow. They don't have to be completely accurate. Mostly I just want someone to be able to look at this and know that I put a good faith effort into depicting the anatomy of a bird as it really is, and not as it would be most convenient to draw. And the shortcuts that are taken are reasonable and do not undermine the respect for the real animal. And that's a learning process, and I might not be there yet, but I am already better at it than when I started working on this design. I have some pictures of her with quite awful wings. So that's the line art. That's done. Now I save. It's always a good idea. Now, maybe you noticed that I didn't save the image until after I'd finished all of the inks, and maybe you were horrified. Maybe, I hope, you were horrified. That's not something you should do. But what's done is done. So now I'm going to do the flats. I have a reference image open because this character already has a set color scheme and I don't feel the need to change it. I'm not going to shade anything, because that can be a little bit confusing on a reference sheet. I always go with just flats and people will shade it how they want to shade it. I've made mistakes about other people's character color schemes because I misinterpreted shading as a color. I just want to make it easy for people not to do that. Now, I don't plan to add like a little palette swatch. I know a lot of people do that. I don't find those very useful because I can't usually tell by looking at it where the colors match the image, even if it's labeled. And this is a limited color palette character. I try to keep my colors pretty limited on character design. I think that it usually reads better, and it certainly saves me a lot of time when I'm flatting. Time is extremely precious when you're doing sequential art. I promise you it is. Now, of course, a lot of character design is storytelling, and the color scheme is no different. So this character is primarily white. This is a world where there are a lot of 4-element themes, earth, water, wind, and fire, and her primary element is air, with a little bit of fire. So she's mostly white, and this pale blue, and this pale gold color, with a little bit of this fiery orange. The image that I'm switching over to is a color test image, and I'm keeping things pretty much the same way as they are there because I liked how it turned out. Now her beak kind of has a parrot-ish look to it, like a cockatiel or a cockatoo, a familiar and friendly bird. Let's see. Since I made that test image, I'm wondering if her little mop of hair should be... Yeah, I like that better, in part because I think it draws the eye down to her eyes more than it does if there's just an expanse of white. So if the ears are golden but the hair is white, then you look at the hair. I don't want people looking at the hair, I want them to look down at her face. Another reason for the white is just that griffins are traditionally eagles. I'm from America, and we often think of bald eagles that have white heads and gold beaks. So this is kind of a visual tie to the eagle while still keeping the domestic animal look. She's got tabby markings, but she also has these kind of Siamese style points. And there are two reasons for that. One is, if you are familiar with cats and different breeds of cats, Siamese cats are mischievous cats, and that was the personality that I chose for this character. She's kind of playful, and also I think that it ties in nicely with these bird legs, which would naturally be a different color than the rest of her fur feather covering. It looks like it blends in more when she has points all over her body, and also the golden beak kind of sort of looks like the point on a Siamese cat's face rather than just being an element that's plopped onto her. Since I picked the colors, I've learned more about the anatomy of wings, and I'm just deciding whether to change placement of the markings, but I think if I do that, the design will be overwhelmed. So, and she also has these tips to her ears because lots of cats have darker tips to the tops of their ears, even if they're not Siamese cats. This tuft on her tail, of course, is also kind of lion-ish, and I'm thinking that I don't want to study this right now. I'm kind of hoping to get this reference sheet done so I have it for Art Fight, and then I can focus on a different character that needs more work. But in future, I might think about making this tail more feathered so that it can actually be used in flight, and then I could work in that tuft at the end to spread out into a fan of feathers. I'm not super fussy about if people get things accurate, but I should be able to get things accurate, so I like having very precise reference sheets for my own use. And the sketchy nature of these stripes might become an issue in future with continuity between panels. So this looks good, and it looks like her stripes reach to about the center of her eye, so I need to maintain that instead of just doing whatever I feel like. So in future, one of the other things I can think about for this design is whether I'm willing to make these stripes more graphic and more simplified in shape. I like the scratchy look. It gives a feeling of softness in fur / feathers / whatever, but sometimes we can't keep exactly what we like because it's just not feasible. When I finish this, I will also add some little captions and helpful text and maybe a little bit of biographic information, but I don't feel the need to record that part. So we are almost done, and please let me know if you enjoyed this video, if you wish I had gone more into something that I didn't speak about, if I didn't explain something in enough detail, and let me know if there is anything that you would like to see me talk about more in depth. I didn't really get into how I'm actually doing line art or flats or the technical parts of the program I'm using, so if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know too. There are a lot of resources on how to use different programs, and I've found it difficult to find resources on what you should draw when you're doing the program, so I was trying to kind of go into what I consider when I draw and why I'm making the choices that I do, because no one else can really explain why you do what you do. There are always people who will be way better at using this program and at drawing and at all the technical things, but no one but you can explain why you're doing what you're choosing to do, if you get my drift. So I try to stick to what I know. Well, alright, I'm just finishing up, and thank you very much for your time and attention. I talked about story attention, a little bit. And you choosing to watch my video is also a use of your limited time and attention, so I appreciate that very much. And I hope that you have a wonderful day wherever you are. And the link to the finished image is in the description.